Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Golin. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Greg M. Epstein, who serves as Humanist Chaplain at Harvard and MIT, where he advises students, faculty, and staff members on ethical and existential concerns from a humanistic perspective. He was TechCrunch's first ethicist in residence and has been called a symbol of the transition in how Americans relate to organized religion by The Conversation. He is the author of the New York Times bestselling book Good Without God and has also written for Time, MIT Technology Review, CNN.com, the Boston Globe, Popular Science, the Washington Post, and Newsweek. His new book is called Tech Agnostic: How Technology Became the World's Most Powerful Religion and Why It Desperately Needs a Reformation. Greg, thanks for being here. Before I let you talk, I just want to say that this book is awesome, and anyone who's listening who hasn't yet purchased it, I'm gonna do the plugging for you because I went into it thinking, okay, this is about technology and religion, and really it's about humanity and the biggest questions that we can be asking ourselves. And it was also very personal, and so much of what you said about your own life really resonated with me. So it was a joy. So congratulations, it's a real accomplishment, and I hope people will read it, and I'm looking forward to diving in on it with you a bit. So let me just first ask you to tell folks in broad strokes, what is this book about?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. It's great to be with you. You're one of my favorite people in the broader humanist movement, not just in the humanistic Jewish movement, and always enjoy getting a chance to talk with you. Um, and it's great to be with this group. I see that there are folks on this Zoom that are some of my oldest friends and teachers and mentors in the Society for Humanistic Judaism, an organization without which I would not be here doing any of this. Hugely influential in my life, kind of goes even beyond influential to sort of crucial in my life. But I assume that there are others on the Zoom that may be less familiar with the organization. So I'll start out with a plug for you and your good work and the people who've preceded you and who are continue to be your colleagues at SHJ. Just can't support the organization enough, and very, very glad that it exists. And what I hope that we'll get a chance to do is talk a little bit about my book, but also my book in the context of this forum and this community. So getting that out of the way, throat cleared, as it were, tell you about this book. It's 6 years in the making, and it is the title is the thesis. It's meant the title is meant somewhat literally. It's Tech Agnostic: How Technology Became the World's Most Powerful Religion and Why It Desperately Needs a Reformation. And it's published by the MIT Press via their distribution partnership with Penguin Random House. So both of those have been very meaningful to me. It means the book sort of gets out there around the world through PRH, but it's been fascinating to publish through an MIT Press, not just one of the top scholarly presses, and the book was peer reviewed. And, in addition to being for a popular audience, it's got like 800 citations and everything was combed through very precisely. But it's MIT, and I've been doing a ton with MIT itself on this book. So the book starts out with some work that I'm doing that's very relevant to SHJ. It doesn't start on chapter one with this, but it starts in my mind, in my heart, with the fact that after I, went to rabbinical school, in fact, even during the process of going to rabbinical school through the IISHJ, I still think it could be called the Wine Institute, but I'll leave that aside. Anyway, I knew that I wanted to do this sort of strange but very interesting job at Harvard as the humanist chaplain at Harvard, which this is my 20th year in that role, and 21st year at Harvard because I was the assistant to the first ever humanist chaplain at Harvard for a year. And using my training as an SHJ rabbi, but also my training at Harvard Divinity School and elsewhere, to serve this sort of multicultural humanist community, atheists, agnostics, allies, etc. Um, and I had in mind the idea of building a multicultural congregation. Um, that was sort of the dream after I published my first book, Good Without God, which ends with a sort of 60-page catalog of all the different ideas and ways in which one could do community for the non-religious. And I was really determined to do it, and I spent the better part of a decade on that work, raising millions of dollars, spending millions of dollars, hiring a brilliant staff, having to deal with the challenges of hiring a staff. And it was, it was popular. Like we would sometimes have lines to get in, and we were meeting. It was a real congregation. People on this call don't need to be introduced to that concept the way that some others that I speak to would. So we're doing that, but it's around 2016, I get the sense that something something's not working for me about it. I mean, I can be a little bit restless anyway, I grant you that. But, I had been pretty consistent in my pursuit of this project. And 2016, my oldest son now is born, and I realized I'd been working 80 hours a week to run my congregation and consistently. And I had been really proud of that, actually, up until that point. It was sort of it was like I was really proud of my workaholism. But I had had a father who hadn't really been able to be present for me emotionally or even even physically in my life very much. And so my son was born, and immediately I knew, like the sort of minute that he was born, I knew in my heart that something major had to change. And try doing the congregation with a little bit less of me. And as many of you who are congregational leaders know, I mean, that's a big challenge in and of itself. But it was also a sense that something was not working for me personally about the congregational model. Part of it was that I had big dreams about this. I saw the congregation not just as, a thing to serve my local community, but I was so motivated to do it, that work. I mean, because I saw that institution as bringing the world closer together. But problem is, that's not my phrasing. That's Mark Zuckerberg's phrasing. Mark Zuckerberg, when he relaunches the Facebook, now Meta, mission statement in 2017, talks about how he wants to bring the world closer together through social media. And he uses a variety of other phrases and language that is intensely congregational. It sounded like he'd gone to rabbinical school or divinity school or whatever. And that struck me at first, but I didn't know how it struck me. It was sort of an ambivalence when I heard it, especially as I was wondering, like, where was my work headed?
So you said that the title is the thesis, right?
Yes.
So you moved out of trying to build community, and you kind of recognized that there is this other thing happening in the world around technology
Yep.
that is replacing religion in some ways for a lot of people who are atheist, agnostic, humanistic.
Hmm.
And so maybe can you give us a definition of tech agnostic?
Sure. So, all right. So, yeah, I just I could go on. Especially this is a fun, but and unique, but very emotional audience for me to speak to, and I'm just trying to be you know really honest with y'all.
I could spend the whole hour trying to figure out what happened congregationally, because that's what I work on, and
Exactly, exactly.
I'm interested in that.
So let me
Yeah.
let me define tech agnostic, but then I'll get back to this. Okay, so it's interesting. I don't often define it in this way, but the idea is Mark Zuckerberg has coined this phrase for he's defined his social media project in a certain way, and it reminds me very, very much of religion. And I start to think to myself, are there other comparisons for tech and religion? And I put this away for a little while, but then in 2018, I'm getting very close to shutting down the congregation. Um, and I get invited to join MIT as the humanist chaplain there. And I had a title for several years as well, convener for ethical life. Building, making connections and, building conversation across the Institute around what it means to live an ethical life in a world of technology, in a technological world. And I had turned down a similar offer, at least similar entreaty a few years earlier, thinking like, I'm already really busy. I'm at one famous university. I don't feel like there's a need for a second one. But 2018, as I'm in a transition mode in my mind and in my career, I start to think about the T in MIT, the technology, and I realized that my life and my friends' lives, my colleagues' lives, and my congregants' lives had been radically reshaped in the previous decade as I had been working on building that congregation by the tech. And that the tech itself, per Mark Zuckerberg's language, was really looking like a religion to me at this point. Like, in other words, just the way that Sherwin Wine and his congregation takes the Torah and puts it in the library and puts the word Adam in front of the community as the sort of object of not worship, not devotion, but certainly the centering object, right? We had at that point in society taken all religious symbolism out of what we were centered on when we gathered in community online. And, to an extent, we were even in the process of taking out what had seemed central at the beginning, which is sort of one another's hopes and joys and concerns and that sort of thing. And it was beginning to feel at that point that the medium had become the message, that the tech itself was foregrounded as the reason for gathering on the tech. We were starting to just talk about the role of tech in our lives in this overweening way at that point. And so I started making a list of ways in which tech was similar to religion. And it's a list that I've never stopped making. And as I cover in the introduction chapter of this book, there are a lot of people before me who've talked about the history, talked about tech as religion. Even some really important theorists and scholars, etc. But the comparisons that I was making, I started to realize, wait a second, if this is a religion, it's actually now become the most powerful one. I mean, think about the influence that, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, all these things combined have had on the world, and on human life over the course of time. But now, what's having more impact? Those things or Silicon Valley big tech? I think the answer is not particularly close. I think Silicon Valley has absolutely blown those institutions out of the water in terms of the impact it's having on most people's day-to-day lives. And so in this new religion, which I'll, maybe get into later, depending on how much time we want to take for this or that, I'm going to argue that it has a theology, it has doctrines, it has hierarchies, it has rituals, and unlike some religions that I could mention, it might just cause an apocalypse. But in that religion, I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. I'm an agnostic. And we could go on from there.
But so let's go on from there, because what you're saying, as I hear it, when you say you're agnostic, is you are not automatically saying the technology is bad,
Mhm.
but you're also not saying it's good. Is that fair?
Yeah, that the idea is I'm not anti-religious. I'm not anti-technological. Um, I wouldn't know how to be anti-technology. I mean that's it sort of would be absurd to me. You know, the idea is that technologies have always existed. I trace in the book the earliest technologies back before even some of the more typical thoughts that people tend to have about that, like, you know, there's the printing press or there's, you know, the domestication of fire. I actually argue that the earliest technology is social technology. It's midwifery. That without women coming together to help each other to give birth, given the increased size of the human brain, you wouldn't be able to have humanity, right? That it's people come together. It's women first who come together. They help one another. They're there for one another, and babies are able to be born, and the human race is off and running. And so, you know, obviously, I don't regret that. And I don't regret the use of all sorts of technologies. But what begins to happen with the advent of what is now referred to as Silicon Valley, which not at all coincidentally is not a real physical place. It doesn't have physical borders. It doesn't have a mayor or a governor. We need a term like that to refer to this institution that is so central to our lives, but it's kind of a mythological concept, right? It's here, it's there, it's everywhere. And in fact, the mythological doesn't even really do it for me because, you know, if I told you that our lives were being run by, you know, Mount Olympus and that Zeus and Hera and Achilles were playing a huge role in our lives today, you know, you'd look at me rightfully like I was a crank. But if I told you that there was a new religion that had garnered millions or even a billion or more followers and was amassing huge amounts of cash and uh, coming to have an incredible influence on our politics, on democracy, on society, on culture, and was increasingly asking people to do strange things. You know, I think you might worry, and you might have real context for that. You might think, okay, yeah, I've seen that many times before. That's what some religions can do. So I think the Silicon Valley concept is much more aptly understood as a religion than as a myth. And so, in that mythological world, um, we're asked to believe really strange things. And that's one of the first couple chapters of the book are I took a deep dive for a couple years into really investigating what do people in Silicon Valley believe. Um,
I
and
see that there's actually, so we made perhaps a mistake in presuming everyone here came in through humanistic Judaism, because
Yep,
one point someone made is religions have to do with imaginary non-existent beings. Technology has nothing to do with that. So let's first of all kind of step back and talk about religion and
yeah,
humanism, right? So I'll just say
yeah,
humanistic Judaism, if you're a newcomer, is a religion. And I've heard from folks in our movement who don't want it to be called a religion. But
right.
I have it from our prophet, Rabbi Sherwin Wine, who called it a religion, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
he pointed out, as others have as well, and as you do in this book, that there are components of religion that go well beyond belief in
yeah,
the supernatural. Oh,
yeah.
oops, I'm sorry, I lost my video.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point to make, right? And I start out, early on in the book with this question of what is religion? And it's not only something that I've been studying personally for getting close to 30 years now since I was a religion concentrator in college. But also, I talk to a really wide range of religion scholars at a lot of different kinds of institutions in order to get to the point where I can sort of give a brief definition of religion for the readers of this book, because um, it's a very slippery term. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there's no one correct definition in my judgment. It's one of the areas where I sort of differ with Sherwin Wine, actually, in the sense that, yeah, I acknowledge that there's this sort of sociological definition of religion that you can apply to us, humanistic Jews, but there's also this sort of popular definition, which, like if it doesn't have a God, etc. So um, that's something for me, that's important, is like I call myself non-religious, but there's lots of ways that you can call this stuff religion.
But in your book, you kind of define the God in Silicon Valley, though, right?
Yeah, yeah. So the God in Silicon Valley is the tech itself, and that's not just my reading of it. There is an enormous, widespread discourse among multi billionaires and their acolytes, their prophets, their priests, etc., that quite literally not just suggests but defines AI as a god. Many examples. I'll give a couple. There is a chart in chapter 2 of my book, from a book called Life 3.0 by a very influential atheist AI philosopher named Max Tegmark, who's a teacher at MIT, professor at MIT, famous guy. So famous, in fact, that he has an institute called the Future of Life Institute that he started with Elon Musk. Elon Musk later left, but this institute received a donation of over $600 million last year from a multi-billionaire in a field that's literally called shitcoin. But anyway, so that Max Tegmark has this chart that we paid his publisher to reprint in chapter 2 of Tech Agnostic, that asks not whether we should create an AI god, but which type of AI god should we create. And then, for example, there's another book called AI Snake Oil, a very nice book by Princeton University Press, came out a couple months before mine did. That it's by two leading Princeton scholars of AI, Arvind Narayan and Sayash Kapoor. The book is about what AI can and can't do, dispelling some myths, etc. But in their influential Substack blog, newsletter advertising their book, they have a blog post that came out right around when their book came out, that the headline of which I think I can quote directly, maybe close paraphrase, is AI companies are pivoting from building God from creating God to building products. Good. And yeah, that is good, but we humanistic Jews like to do close textual analysis. That's how we figure out that Jews in the ancient world did in fact worship gods like Asherah, and that Yahweh wasn't the only God in the land, etc. Right? So textually, if you have to pivot in perhaps the most influential industry in the world today from building a god, that means there must have been or must be a whole lot of God building going on. And I walk people through a lot of examples in both chapter 1 and chapter 2 of this sort of thinking, again, by people who have billions of dollars, and are really trying to use those dollars to be incredibly influential on our way of thinking, our way of life. They literally call it a god, and they see themselves as ushering in with their God, with their new religion. Of course, they're the prophets, they're the priests of this religion, demigods even perhaps, and they see themselves as ushering in a very big and brave and bold new reality where we're going to do things like end death as we know it. I'm paraphrasing the AI pioneer Ray Kurzweil, who who was the guiding force behind the development of Google's Gemini, the new AI program that one of the world's largest companies has now sort of devoted itself to. And Kurzweil saw himself as creating Gemini to reincarnate his father,
Yeah.
his dead father. That was told to me by Blake Lemoine, who was the former Google software engineer who published the transcript of his conversation with his coworker, the AI itself, um, and was fired for that. But I flew him to MIT. I got it some funding, flew him to MIT. We had a big conversation with him. And Lemoine says, look, I was working with Ray Kurzweil, and Ray was he was using this to recreate his father, reincarnate his father. Tchiyat Metim, for those of you who know the Hebrew prayer, um, which is, of course, something that we say, three times a day in Orthodox Judaism and four times on the Sabbath. And yeah, Kurzweil says we're ushering in the singularity, which is a time where we're all going to upload ourselves into the cloud. That singularity is coming at any moment. He sounds like an eschatological, Christian preacher at that point. And it's just around the corner. And he says in his book, The
The
Singularity is
singularity
Near,
is near.
we're gonna make life meaningful.
Right.
And I said to him recently, I met him at MIT recently, and I said, doesn't that fly in the face of 2000 plus years of both religion and secular philosophy, which would suggest that life has already been meaningful? And he looks at me and, he's never been asked that question before. And he says, all right, well, maybe life has been somewhat meaningful up until now, but, and,
I was going to say, because I read that and am seduced by the idea of singularity, if I'm fully honest. And even as gullible as I recognize I was in reading his book, I was still thinking to myself, this is a really optimistic view
mm,
of the future when there seems to be so many potentially dystopian paths that seem a lot more obvious, particularly when you look at who's running the show in so many of these places and their lack of emphasis on ethics, which I appreciate is what you're trying to call attention to.
yeah,
So I want to bring in another religious concept that you talk about, which I'm also thinking a lot about, which is apocalypse.
mm,
And that potential very dystopian future of an AI that no longer sees the reason to have humans or sees us only as batteries, like in the Matrix. Spoiler alert,
yeah,
but it's a 25-year-old movie. But it's like the future is set out there as well, and you know, to me, I'm fascinated by stories of apocalypse because it's been with humanity, as you point out in the book, since the get-go. But the
yeah,
thing is, it's only been realistic for like the past 70 years. I mean, I
yeah,
remember sitting in my fifth grade hallway because it was a drill for a nuclear blast, right? I don't know if it's progress that my kids don't do that now. Instead, they do lockdowns for active shooters. So I don't know whether that's better or worse, but those nuclear weapons are still out there. And every so often I think about that. And I think that I'm sure that there are folks in that
well,
industry.
Microsoft
Yeah.
just purchased 3 Mile Island.
Oh my God. I mean,
Microsoft
I'm sure
purchased
there, yeah,
Three
that's
Mile
great.
Island. They purchased 3 Mile Island because the chatbots that they're running, both theirs Copilot and then also OpenAI, with which they have a partnership, running ChatGPT. Although, of course, Mateo Wong, the tech editor, recent Harvard graduate, um, uh, who also went to my high school, oddly, says that the GPT era is over as of this week. So we're now we're into the new thing, which is why some OpenAI people are sort of leaking that actually AGI, artificial general intelligence, actually does exist already. So they're saying essentially we have already built a God, but we're not ready to reveal it. That's what they say. I mean, that's a rumor that's
And
floating
someone's going to
around.
say, put them in charge of the nukes instead, right?
But
I mean,
but anyway, so Microsoft buys 3 Mile Island to power that stuff, specifically to power that, because the data centers that power these chatbots that we're using require so much power that first of all, that they need new sources, and so we're buying 3 Mile Island, coal-firing plants that have been brought offline because of desperate climate concerns are now being brought back online to power chatbots as well for OpenAI and Microsoft and Google and others. Um, and yeah, and this is the environment that we're living in. By the way, the fact that it costs so much electricity wise um, also impacts the fact that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, is going around right now asking our government and leading people in civil society for $5 to $7 trillion of immediate investment to build the data centers that are going to require almost exponentially more of that electricity, right? Which will require more of that power infrastructure, because he says that as he tweeted at one point, um, abundance is our birthright, literally echoing not only birthright Israel, but the book of Genesis and the idea that we should be fruitful and multiply. Altman sat on the stage at Memorial Church at Harvard just a few months ago and called his technology miraculous. It's not a coincidence at all. The idea is that company is absolutely burning cash, and on any kind of normal business model, normal business evaluation scale, it would be considered a failure, and we'd be wondering how to transition it into retirement. But because he and others have successfully positioned these companies as not just too big to fail, as like an Enron was or whatever, but too mythological, too spiritual, too godly to fail. You can't let the Catholic Church fail. You can't let Hinduism fail. You can't let Islam fail. People in Israel can't let a certain kind of vision for Judaism fail, even though it seems, when you look at what's happening in Israel, to be failing. I'm not saying anything about Zionism basically, but I'm saying, if you look at what's happening in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, something's failing there, in my judgment. And so, they've convinced us that this is a religion for which there's a spiritual calling.
yeah.
If any other major religion had, yeah,
Yeah.
had come along, we'd criticize it. So that's
Right.
the last third of the book, third to a half of the book. I won't spend much time talking about it today, but I really want people listening to know a third to a half of the book is the positive alternative. It's the Reformation. I'm a tech agnostic because I don't know which technology is going to truly be beneficial to humanity and which ones aren't, although I have my suspicions, of course, with many of these. Um, I don't believe religion should be eliminated, but I do believe it must be reformed, right? So, although, humanistic Judaism has had sort of an ambivalent relationship with Reformed Judaism, I'd rather have the Reformed Jews of the world, to negotiate with, to partner with, than the fundamentalist Christian nationalists of the world, for example, right? And so, I like reformed, self-critical religion. And there are essentially, as I researched this over 5, 6 years, there are a lot of people in the tech space who are doing a lot of great work to reform what I call the religion of tech. And some of them are building congregations for responsible and ethical tech. Some of them are what I would call humanists or spiritual practitioners, building sort of positive alternatives in other ways, the way that, humanistic rabbis might build alternatives to traditional Judaism. Some of them are just heretics and apostates against the sort of tech mythology and religion, which, by the way, of course, for several folks in this movement have been categorized that way as well, and well, well, they should be in many ways. So it's really using my education in humanistic Judaism and humanism more broadly to say, this is a really apt metaphor and a really useful tool for thinking about what tech needs. And ultimately, I think it could be one of the best use cases in broader society for knowledge about humanism. Like I'm arguing that this stuff has become religion. I want to talk to everybody around the world as much as I can, especially in the tech industry, about that and tell them, it's not that we need to eliminate tech or eliminate religion, but we need a lot more humanism.
Well, I'm on board with that. And I will say, though, that one of the things that is so challenging and disappointing when I recall how amazed I was in the late 90s as the World Wide Web was coming online and in the early 2000s, thinking that if people have access to all the information in the world, how are they going to stay fixated on these ancient ideologies
Mm,
when you've got the truth right available for you? And instead, what's happened is the technology has empowered fundamentalism, and it's based on non-truth that is spread and in, I guess, either in silos where they're not exposed to actual truth, or the whole notion of truth gets called into question.
yeah.
So I think it's a huge challenge, but I think that's the challenge. I think that's the work that has to get done.
Yeah. I mean, I see a lot of folks making comments. I haven't had a chance to look
Yeah,
at what
I've
they are,
got,
but
let me
great,
jump
great stuff,
into.
I'm sure.
So Adam asks, as a parent of three young daughters, I'm very concerned about the effects of technology on neurodevelopment, social media in particular. Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation is a really great read on this. I think we as a society need to rethink when we initiate our kids into the cult of technology.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, thanks, Adam and others. I'll say, Jonathan Haidt is an interesting character because he's been able to be pretty impactful with his critique of social media, but the some of the folks that I talk to in the sort of tech scholarship space will tell you that Haidt, who's sort of a popularizer of psychology, who once put me up at his house in Charlottesville many, many years ago, 2008. He's very nice. I was coming through, and no, he that's right. He wanted to put me up at his house. I'm sorry, but he had a new baby at the time, so he paid for a hotel room for me. So he's a nice guy. I did a dialogue with him at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in New York City in 2015. But he is not a lot of the stuff that he's talking about is not necessarily so evidence based. And we're big on evidence based in the humanist movement of all stripes. People are saying that the claims that he's making against some of the technologies that he's talking about need to, let's say, be further investigated. And I'm not against all social media, but like I've enjoyed getting back. I really had gotten sick of Twitter and Facebook, whatever, but I've been enjoying getting back on Blue Sky, for example. And what I'm against is algorithmic manipulation. What I'm against is people essentially recruiting us for the cult of Silicon Valley by getting us to, as was first sort of famously explored with Facebook, getting us to not be the customer, which I'm fine with being the customer for a reasonable business, but not the customer, but we're now the product, right? So, this was something that people began to notice, around 2016 and afterwards, that Facebook had been surveilling us so much that, of course it was free because we're not the customer anymore. We're the product that it sells to the tune of now billions of dollars, actually. In fact, Facebook and Google together have sold a couple trillions of dollars total in the past decade plus in advertising. So Facebook, I think, is a little over a trillion. Don't quote me on that exactly. I might be off by a bit. But you can find the link in my Time Magazine essay about this stuff. And so, you know, we're the product by which they sell that kind of advertising that makes them that much money. And kids going online to exchange information about one another. I mean, that seems pretty natural to me. And yes, we need to be monitoring it. But it's not in itself an evil. What can look pretty pernicious is when we're sold the glory and grandeur of that method of communing with one another, of congregating with one another, in order to mythologize the company so that we can devote ourselves slavishly to it.
I just want to break down this to even more basic concern. So you have two young kids. My kids are slightly older.
Mhm.
I'm in a constant battle over screen time
Yeah.
with myself and then with them, right? And
Right, because
they,
they, as Sherwin would say, like they look at our behavior, not our
yeah,
not our words.
they learned the word hypocrite very early on
Hmm.
and throw it at me whenever I tell them like no screen at the dinner table while I'm answering a text, right? So, how do you deal with it yourself, knowing all that you know about the tech and the good and the bad of it?
Yeah.
And, I hear what you're saying though. For me, my daughter is doing digital art, and in fact, for her birthday, I'm getting her an iPad. Like I'm
Yeah.
encouraging it because she's good at it. And until AI completely takes that business over, maybe she can have fun with it. And at the other end, I see her on YouTube, and not YouTube, but YouTube Shorts. So the attention span is like this, and she's
Yeah.
like this, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the balancing act is really tough. And
Yeah. No, it really is. It's first of all, all empathy and sympathy to you, and I'm dealing with it all exactly the same way. One way to look at that, by the way, is if tech is a religion, it's not the cafeteria religion that we're used to from today's culture, where you can pick a Kabbalah bracelet to wear, like Madonna, but you can also wear a rosary that you're fingering, and you can do some Buddhist meditation. That's up. No, this is religion in the sense of the ancient world with the ancient temples, where you're born under the realm of a given god. You're forced or obligated to worship that god, and if you say, "Well, I don't want to, I don't enjoy worshiping Yahweh or whatever," at best, you'll be seen as a very strange personality, and most likely you'll be ostracized or just forced to kneel. It's that kind of God that we're dealing with, that kind of religion that we're dealing with now. But let me say, on an optimistic note, though, one of my absolute favorite parts of this book to write is in chapter 4 on ritual. So each chapter is a comparison, an extended meditation on a given aspect of technology and comparing it to a given aspect of religion. And so the ritual chapter is exploring my struggles with tech addiction, which I might have been when I wrote about tech addiction in Good Without God. I might have actually ended up being the first writer in English, at least, to write about addiction to modern day Silicon Valley digital devices. And then I wrote about it again for the Boston Globe in an ideas section cover story that was published on January 1st, 2021, coming out of the pandemic. We'd all been so addicted to our screens necessarily that year that I wanted to give people a sense of my own battles with it. And I was very personal about my experiences with addiction. Although I've never been addicted to a physical drug, I just felt like I'd been addicted to tech for a long time. Um, and interestingly, the piece, reached an audience, but I think it was seen as a little bit quirky at the time. And then 3 years later, the same week, the first week of the new year, this year, actually, both Kashmir Hill of the New York Times and Christopher Mims of the Washington Post, I mean, of the Wall Street Journal, rather, came out with extremely similar pieces that both referenced addiction to tech in the headline and both referenced the same devices that I had talked about, like the same alternative low tech devices that I had reviewed for the Globe 3 years earlier. So, anyway, I this really fun piece that I wrote in chapter 4 is about how I realized as I was researching this book that if tech can be addictive, it's not something that we can tell our kids or ourselves to go cold turkey from. You can't, if you developed a heroin problem, Paul, or if I did, I would hope that we'd be on the Zoom with one another, encouraging each other to stop immediately, right? But this, you can't tell your kid to stop using the tech immediately. You can't even not buy your daughter the iPad if she's really getting into this stuff. You've got to encourage it in some way. So what I did, and I'm about to start working on, I've been invited by I'll leave it nameless, but one of the bigger publications that, one of the publications that a lot of this, people on here probably read, has invited me to do a piece on this, or at least to send them a piece on this, and we'll see what happens, about talking to eating disorder experts. So I went around and I talked to a real diverse group of eating disorder experts, on how to treat tech addiction. And they, I won't give away for in a limited time format like this what I came up with or what they came up with, but I'll just say they really inspired me to view my relationship with tech differently. Like I'm not that stressed anymore about when I'm on tech and when I'm not on tech. I do avoid using it at the dining room table. But tonight, there was an interesting clip about me on the web. And I was like, you know what? I'd like to show this to my mom and my son, and my wife at the dining room table. So it's not a fixed thing. It's something that if you have an eating disorder, you still have to eat. And you really have to try to have a healthy relationship with your food. You can't just like eat but hate eating. So, I think that we can learn to love using this stuff as tools, um, with the hope that it will help us to build community, but avoid the sort of fear-based motive of I'm using this tech because I'm terrified that I'm going to be left behind, or I'm terrified that no one will love me unless I get likes online, etc. There's a lot more to say about it, but I'll let people read that part.
Right. And I was actually going to go there because Rabbi Eva talks about what they're seeing in the psychological therapeutic world with the huge negative impact on tech on the psychological and emotional well-being of young people.
Yeah.
And it made me think of the part of your book that really impacted me emotionally, where you talk about the relationship between um, achievement and self-worth,
Mm,
and how you had connected those things and how you worked so hard to decouple them. And like along with what you were describing, this may also be the kind of messages that we need to get out there to young people, because I can see how devastating it is to be flipping through like Instagram and just seeing one beautiful digitally altered person after the next, or one person traveling the world in, drinking champagne on yachts, one after the other, as reality, and then trying to compare yourself to that and the inevitable negative impact that would have if that's your measurement for success.
yeah, it's very, very sad at times. It's angering at times. It's worrisome, perhaps most of all. And so, what I would suggest for people, and where I come to ultimately with this idea of how to reform the religion of tech, and I end in an agnostic place, where I say, like, look, I don't have all the answers. I'm not going to tell you every single thing policy wise, et cetera, that needs to happen to reform this religion. But that's okay, because I do explore in real depth the stories of some of the key people who are doing that reforming work. There were some of the most fascinating and most impactful what I'll call tech reformers who, as over the course of writing the book, they let me into their lives and revealed like really harrowing personal stories that I was able to kind of exclusively tell in this book, or at least certain details that like Vina Dubal, the fighter against Uber and Lyft and their manipulation of the ride sharing industry. At one point, I asked her like, "So, do you think that your brother's mysterious death had anything to do with this sort of, heretical crusade that you've been on?" And she said, "Well, I don't think so ultimately, but you're not the first to ask. In fact, my father suspected that as well." And so, just to kind of put a pin there, but ultimately where I land is, I think we really need to be proud of our agnosticism. And, Sherwin would always say, as far as I recall anyway, that, as humanists, we serve both atheists and agnostics, and he has a great passage about that in his essay, in his sort of the book that's ultimately a biography of him, episodic biography. And you know, yet for me, agnosticism was a bit of a wishy-washy type of humanism. I always preferred the more nervy atheist side of humanism. And in many ways I still do, but I talk about agnosticism at the end of the book, in a very proud way, because ultimately what we've just done is we've elected a president of the United States again, who obviously is a many times over convicted felon, etc. But what he really is somebody that comes across as extraordinarily confident in himself and in the future. Not that he is, but he comes across that way. At a time where people are dealing with enormous uncertainty because of huge changes to our climate, to our technology. If people are saying that in 10 years we're all going to be uploaded into the cloud and we're going to end death, that's extremely destabilizing. Think about that, right? And even changes to our values. People are so uncertain about what the future holds for any of us that they're afraid. And so his confidence can come across as comforting. But of course, it's not comforting, and it shouldn't be considered such. And so I think we need a renaissance of pride in our uncertainty, a renaissance of pride in the idea that we don't know yet, but we're trying to figure it out. And we have to be very, very comfortable and even joyful about that as a way to live, because otherwise people will be, set in their fear, and they're going to look to radical certainty. So that's where I come down, and yeah,
Do you think it's going to be a lot harder now? I mean, he seems to have gotten a lot of support from the tech industry, and Elon Musk seems to be his best buddy currently.
yeah, I
Um,
mean, yeah, this is going to be.
and you want to say who it was that
Oh,
the clip was
yeah.
from?
I think I was pretty excited about it earlier this evening, and I'm not sure how I feel about it now. But it's like I just got this clip. It was sent to me by a national news reporter named Jack Jenkins about how Pete Hegseth, the nominee, the very controversial nominee for Secretary of Defense of the United States, gave a speech about 6 months ago at a megachurch where he cited my election as for a term as president of the Harvard Chaplains as the moment where he knew that he should tear his Harvard degree down off the wall and mail it back to the university and such. He gets excited about it, and I guess I was excited that if you're gonna do so much anti-humanism, that at least mention our name. So yeah, I mean, I think that I've done a lot of political work these past several years as a humanist. I was invited by the Biden campaign in 2020 to be the national chair of Humanists for Biden, and other things like that. And I think it's going to be a very dark time, in many ways in the coming years. There's going to be an enormous amount of work to be done. But it's ultimately it's a Sisyphean task. And I say that in a positive way. When I sign people's books in person, the Tech Agnostic, I've been drawing a stick figure of Sisyphus, the mythological figure made famous by Albert Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus, pushing his rock, and I tell people keep pushing. Um, because ultimately, I think one of the things that humanists really give as a gift to the world that you all on this call, people like Miriam and Eva, and I'm not sure which Adam is on the call, but if it happens to be Adam Shalom or others, have given me as a gift, an indispensable gift that, again, support your humanistic Jewish movement, support the SHJ, support the individual congregations, support our rabbinical programs, support all of it. We need it so badly right now, right? But one of the gifts that you all have given me is this, pride um, in a way of life that is, it's pursuing truth as we find it, and it's of knowing that the world is not, it was not meant to be other than it is. There's no conscious manager of the universe that decided that we all need to have perfect, peaceful, problem-free lives, and therefore we need to expect problems. The world is a mess, but it's a mess that we're increasingly tidying up and arranging into more of a home. And the best way to tidy it up and arrange it for a home is to encourage and bring about justice and equity, inclusion, um, to fight for health and education and human dignity in every and any place and case. And that the struggle itself to do that from the existentialist humanist or the humanistic Jewish perspective is itself enough to bring us joy. But as one of my that's Camus, but as one of my students a few years ago pointed out, if Sisyphus is alone in pushing the rock up the hill, she said, I'm not sure that he's really all that joyful. We can't do it alone. And you and I could go on for hours, Paul, about how the congregational model is in a lot of trouble. It has been radically destabilized by tech and Silicon Valley. And it's not clear that it will survive long term into the future, unless it has sort of a legacy. Like if people don't have an endowment for their congregation, who knows if their congregation is going to be solvent in 10, 20 years. But what we do know is that we always have to keep going with social technologies that bring people closer together in ways that are better morally and ethically than Meta. We need to keep up the work of looking after one another and inspiring one another. And that's something that I do believe that SHJ can and will continue to do well into the future.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you ending us with an optimistic vision. I also, felt strongly about the section you talk about going to the sleepaway camp with your family and not even feeling like you needed to check your phone, right? Because
Yeah.
you were with people, and being with people in person is still irreplaceable. And that's the business part of our model that we have to also kind of put out there as a benefit. And there are inklings of young people who are kind of revolting, which you also talk about, against the technology to do those kind of things, the in-person, the low-tech get-togethers and so on. So I appreciate it. I hope everyone will read this book. I think you set out some really good potential next steps for us at the end of the book. And best of luck with it.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a real pleasure to talk to you and to talk to the community and hope to see you all again sometime. This is it's a got to go put the kids to get to bed in a minute, but this is a real pleasure for me to be part of this conversation.
Well, love to your family, and have a great night, and I hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks so much for stopping in and listening. I really appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.